Hi, it's Nero here from Investment Rise, and today I want to talk about 3 property investing rules you need to break if you want to succeed with property investing in 2021. Now, why do I call these rules that you need to break? Well, I guess when you say rules, they're really kind of like rules of thumb, and what I would actually call them to be is actually myths. But the reason a lot of people want to know what these rules are and they follow these rules is because there are a lot of people out there who invest in property without doing any research whatsoever. Now, I know that's not you, because at least you are smart enough to be here, you're watching this video, you're trying to educate yourself, you're doing your research, and for that I totally commend you and I congratulate you. But a lot of people don't do that. And so even though you are clearly not one of those naive investors who just buy something based off a colorful brochure, I still want you to know what these property investing rules are, these rules of thumb that are no longer valid in 2021, so that when you're looking to buy your first or your next investment property, if your all-knowing uncle or your brother-in-law or whoever is in your inner circle who, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, let's say they do have your best intentions at heart, but because they don't have the qualifications or the experience, they may guide you down the wrong path, because they may tell you to invest according to some of these rules, okay? And by the end of today, I want you to be totally aware of what these are and why you need to make sure you break them, you avoid them, you essentially don't follow these particular rules, okay? So let's get to the first one, and it's this. When buying an investment property, buy as close as possible to the CBD that you can afford. All right, now you can immediately understand the logic, I guess, behind this. You can almost understand why people would believe in this particular rule, because it's a case of, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, I guess, capital growth starts in the city and then it goes out in rings. And so you really want to look to invest as close as possible to the city as possible to maximize your capital growth, right? But that's completely and utterly not true in 2021. Why? Because we've seen the fact that there's been a shift in the property market. Now, if you've seen any of my past videos, you know that I called the property boom and said that the property boom started back in October of 2020. But I also said that the property boom this time would be very, very different. And we're starting to see that data right now. For example, check this out. Sydney property, middle ring suburbs, now more expensive than inner city for first time. Suburbs in the middle ring of Sydney now have the highest median house price after overtaking siblings closer to the city. The new data from real estate agency PRD found suburbs within 5 to 10 kilometers of the CBD performed the strongest in 2020, with the median price of these properties above the inner ring for the first time. Right? And that's from the Daily Telegraph. But it actually doesn't paint the whole picture, because if you actually look at the data and where people are getting the most capital growth, especially in Sydney, and we'll come to some of the other cities in a moment, but in Sydney, the most of the capital growth is actually happening on the outer suburbs, as you can see from this data. Sydney real estate, Central Coast, Outer West record biggest jump in house prices. Home buyers on the Central Coast and Sydney's outer suburbs will have to fork up an average of about $40,000 to $60,000 more for properties than buyers did last year due to runaway growth in prices. It comes as CoreLogic data published this week revealed the Central Coast and outer regions, including the Blue Mountains and Blacktown, were Sydney's fastest growing housing markets over the year to February. Price growth in these areas not only eclipsed the citywide average, but dwarfed increases in Sydney's traditional, more sought-after eastern suburbs, inner west, North Shore, and inner city. And if we look at this particular table here, what you can see is that the Central Coast rose by 9.3% in the 12 months to February. Blacktown, 6.2%. Outer West, the Blue Mountains, 6.0%. But here's what's interesting. If you go down to the bottom of this particular table, you can see the traditionally strong performing areas like the North Shore of Sydney, negative 0.3%, Inner West, negative 0.9%, City and Inner South, negative 0.9%, Sutherland, negative 0.8%. Now, this is not a crash by any stretch of the imagination, and remember, these are just average data points. Like, for example, if you look at Sutherland, the Shire as a whole, Cronulla, for example, a suburb, was the second strongest performing suburb in terms of capital growth, with prices rising 21.4% in the last 12 months. Right? So you can't just use these as gospel, but they do paint a very interesting picture. And they do show you that when you're looking to invest in property now, you can no longer follow that old maxim, that old so-called rule of buying as close as possible to the city that your budget allows. Right? You're going to be much better off doing some actual research and buying in areas that are more than likely on the outer suburbs, especially in Sydney or the Central Coast. In Newcastle, for example, we're seeing real estate agents tell us that prices are flying up, and most in demand is house and land packages, right? So you need to understand that you need to invest differently. This boom is going to be different. In fact, CoreLogic's head of research, Eliza Owen, said recent buyer patterns were markedly different to those seen in previous boom markets. The last housing boom from 2013 to 2017 was primarily led by investors purchasing properties within inner city areas, whereas first home buyers and upsizers in outer suburbs were leading the recent change, Ms. Owen said. But as you can see now from this graph as well, you can see that most of the demand so far in housing has come from first home buyers and what I call home upgraders. It's come from owner-occupiers, in other words. Investor demand is still very, very low. But that is starting to change as more and more investors realize that instead of buying units, they need to buy houses, and they start entering the market because of the record low interest rates, because of all the money that's circulating in the economy, which I'll talk about in a moment. You're going to start seeing more and more investors entering the market. So if you are an investor and you're thinking about whether I should be entering the market now or not, what I can tell you is in many of these areas that are growing in value, the longer you wait, the more you're going to pay. All right, so you can't just buy anything close to the city. You do need to do your research, but there are some amazing opportunities out there for you to look to invest in. Property investing rule number 2 that you need to break. And it's not so much a rule or a rule of thumb as a myth, I guess. And what it is this. The myth is property prices, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, are so expensive that they have to fall, because if they keep getting more and more expensive, well, people can't afford those prices. So you're better off to wait until property prices fall. Right? Now, this has been the argument from every single so-called, property bear, everyone who thinks that property prices need to fall because they're too expensive, especially in our bigger cities. I mean, we've seen people as recently as last year talk about that. People came back in 2016 and said the property prices were going to fall in Sydney and Melbourne. Hey, they even went back in 2012 and said the property prices were too high back then. And yet, what have prices done since 2012, especially in Sydney and Melbourne? Right? And so prices today, mind you, I don't blame you if you think they're expensive, because the fact is they are, but they're also rising in value, right? And if you think property prices are rising fast in Australia, check this out. In an article in the Sydney Morning Herald of late January 2021, economist Saul Eslake compared to the property boom seen in other countries during the pandemic, said that Australia's rebound has been quite modest so far. I think it's important to view what's happening to Australian house prices in a global context, he explains. Residential property prices have been remarkably resilient in most countries, thanks to record low interest rates and ample supply of credit. Since February last year, Australian national dwelling prices have grown more slowly than in Canada, the United States, the UK, Singapore, Norway, Hong Kong and Germany, Eslake says. Prices in New Zealand were up 13.5%. It's no wonder their government and central bank are talking about what to do to rein them in. But secondly, we have not just the fact that our prices are not even rising as much as what they are in many other countries around the world. But just last week, as I record this video, the Reserve Bank of Australia quietly announced that they were going to print an extra $100 billion at a rate of $5 billion a week. Right, this is their new policy of quantitative easing, or QE, that I've spoken about in earlier episodes. Now, and if you watch any of those, you know that as a result of all this extra money essentially being printed through QE, the supply of money goes up, and eventually that money finds itself into what we call hard assets. And especially in Australia, hard assets are property. And so the fact is, with record low interest rates, and the more the RBA seems to feel the need to keep printing money, the more property prices are going to rise. That is almost unavoidable. In fact, there was a recent statement put out by the RBA where they expect property prices to rise on average 30% over the next 3 years. That's on average, which means some areas are obviously going to do worse, but some areas are going to rise in value by more than 30% over the next 3 years. Right? And the RBA is like totally okay with that. And they're printing more money, obviously because they feel it's going to help the economy, but they're well aware that a lot of that money is going to find its way into property. So yes, property prices are expensive, but in many, many areas, you're going to find that what seems expensive today is going to seem cheap when you look back on property in 5 years' time. And you certainly want to take advantage of this next wave of price growth. I think it's here to stay for some time yet. Now, before I get on to the third and final rule that you need to break and not follow in 2021, if you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel. We release videos like this on a weekly basis, and hit that notification bell so you'll never miss out when we release a new video. So, property rule number 3 that you need to break, it's simply this. If you can't afford a house in a good area, buy an apartment there. Okay, and that is a rule that used to work. As I said, this current property boom is so different to anything we've seen in the past, right? In the past, yeah, if you couldn't afford a house in a good suburb or an expensive suburb, yeah, you could buy a unit there and you would still do well from a capital growth perspective. But that's no longer the case today. In fact, let's have a look at the following table, which shows where prices have fallen, and it's totally in the unit market. Kellyville, where units have dropped nearly $72,000. Rouse Hill, where units have dropped over $88,000. Right? I mean, look at some of these areas. Strathfield, units have dropped nearly $58,000. And mind you, in just these 3 areas that I've mentioned, house prices have actually risen. Okay? And so that's where you need to really understand that if you can't afford a house in a particular suburb, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, you almost certainly do not want to buy a unit in that particular suburb. You want to go and look at other suburbs where house prices that fit your budget are rising in value. But let's keep going further. High-rise apartment sales continue to drag Sydney housing market despite boom. Home buyers may be paying inflated sums for houses at the moment, but it's been a different story for unit buyers in Sydney's emerging high-rise suburbs who have been scoring homes for lower prices. CoreLogic's Hedonic Home Value Index, released this week, showed the house and unit markets were moving in opposite directions, with house prices ballooning and unit prices falling across the board. Now, of course, there are some suburbs, yes, where unit prices are rising, but as a general rule of thumb, unit prices are falling. And of course, different suburbs are performing differently. But let's have a look at some of the worst performing suburbs right now. Some of the biggest price drops were in the Ryde region and the corridor of suburbs between Olympic Park and Parramatta, where developers have released a slew of new apartment projects. North Ryde unit prices dropped by an average of 13.5%, while in the Parramatta CBD and nearby Auburn, the drops were 9 and 10% respectively. Apartment prices in Homebush and Olympic Park dropped by about 5%, and further south, Baralla unit prices dropped 11.5%. right? And that was from realestate.com.au. But what about this article, also from realestate.com.au? Losses mount for apartment sellers in Sydney's oversupplied high-rise region. Falling rents from international border closures have smashed property investors in Sydney's emerging high-rise suburbs, and many incurred serious losses. A review of sales over the lead up to spring 2020 showed close to 1 in 5 home sellers in the densely populated Parramatta and Strathfield council areas lost money on their sales, with the median loss at nearly $50,000. Now, are you really willing to take that risk? Right? Just because you might be familiar with a suburb, and you may have what I call a suburb bias or hometown bias. In other words, you live close to an area and you think you know the area, and maybe you can't afford a house, especially in the high-priced areas of Sydney and Melbourne. That does not mean you should buy a unit there, even though that might have worked in the past. It's not going to work in 2021. So they are the 3 myths, the 3 rules that you need to break. You need to not follow these rules, even though I can almost guarantee you some of your friends, some of your family, people who may even be successful investors in the past, they may even advise you to follow these 3 rules. Do not in any way follow them. Don't just think that you can buy anything close to city and you're going to get the most amount of capital growth. Don't think that property prices, because they're so high, because prices are so expensive, they're going to fall, and especially in the house market. And number 3, if you can't afford a house in a particular suburb where you see prices rising, be so careful about buying a unit there. And if you're unsure in any way, shape or form, avoid that area, do your research, and find another area that fits your budget where property prices are rising. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video valuable and you're thinking you might like my help to help you find an investment property, then head on over to nerocall.com to discover our unique 5-step process that's helped my private client group purchase now well over $66.2 million worth of property. And then if you like what you see, you can book in for a half-hour phone consult with me personally. Either way, thanks again for watching.